Continuing in The Great Wheel by Robert Lawson. This is chapter 12. Here's a picture of the Ferris wheel. The wheel was finished, completely finished. The last carpenter and electrician had gone. The painters had departed, leaving booths, ticket offices, and waiting rooms odorous of fresh paint and varnish. To Con and Uncle Patrick, looking up at the towering mass, it all seemed unreal, impossible. The setting sun bathed the top of the wheel in golden light. Reflected fire from the gleaming windows of the cars struck sparkles from the shining brass. The lower part was in shadow. The platform where they stood was dim. Instinctively, both their minds went back to that far-off, freezing January day when Mr. Ferris had so confidently predicted that the wheel would be operating between the 15th and the 20th of June. This was the evening of June 20th. Tomorrow the wheel would be turning. Did you ever think it would be, Uncle Patrick, Con asked, that it would be done in time, or ever? Mr. Ferris said it would, Uncle Patrick answered with beautiful simplicity. The last few days had been hectic ones for Con, as for everyone else. Sergeant Keough had vigorously trained his guards from sun-up to sundown. Each morning they lined up with military precision for inspection, smart as West Pointers in their handsome new uniforms. White cotton gloves were immaculate, shoes, belts, and buttons highly polished, chins freshly shaven. There followed strenuous exercise in wrestling, boxing, and the latest methods of subduing unruly customers, should any appear. Unobtrusively tucked in each guard's hip pocket was a short, shot-filled billy, which he was taught to use efficiently, and draped across his chest was a nickel chain attached to a police whistle for emergency use. In addition to all this were lessons in politeness and first aid, and incessant fire drills. Using a large map of the fairgrounds, each guard was required to memorize all the important fair buildings as well as most of the landmarks of Chicago. And no matter how much you know, the sergeant added, somebody will think up some blithering question you don't, in which case, use your imagination. Mr. Ferris joined them, and for some time the three contemplated the wheel in silence. Well, Pat, Mr. Ferris finally said, we seem to have done it. I promised that it would be in operation by June 20th, and this is June 20th. I promised that it would be safe, and it is safe. However, Mrs. Ferris and I will try it out first, as usual, tonight. Con, I would like you to be here, in uniform. Mrs. Ferris hasn't yet seen her creation, and I know she would like to. You set it off well. It may be rather late. We have a dinner engagement. He shook hands warmly with Uncle Patrick. Pat, he said, I can't begin to tell you how much I owe you. Once more, you have made a dream come true. Without you, I might have been a brain of sorts, but no hands. Thank you for all you've done. That evening, Con in all his glory waited on the empty platform. For the first time, the cars were lighted, making the huge wheel the most conspicuous feature of the entire fairgrounds. The boiler had been fired up and now sizzled quietly. The firemen dozed. Mr. Barry, the elderly engineer, ceased with his everlasting polishing and wandered over to chat with Con. Little Betsy's just raring to go, he said. I'd just as lief they'd come along soon as we could give that old wheel a spin. Everything ready, and she hasn't made a full revolution yet. Oh well, she'll make plenty tomorrow. I'm thinking with all the world clamoring for a ride on her. He wandered back, looked at his gauges, screwed down a grease cup or two, and settled in a chair with a copy of Nick Carter. For the 100th time, Con went over his instructions. When the car comes to rest, you will unlock the north door and say, all out, please. Those wishing another ride will please purchase tickets at the ticket booth. When all the passengers are out, you will relock the north door and unlock the open the south door. You will then say, all aboard, please. Kindly step to the far end of the car. When all the passengers are aboard, you will close and lock the south door. Remember, both doors must always be locked and the key in your pocket except when loading and unloading. Con went through the routine of locking and unlocking the doors and putting the key in his pocket a half-dozen times. He was so busy with it that he failed to notice the Ferrises' arrival until he heard their voices. They both wore evening clothes, and Con thought Mrs. Ferris was the most beautiful vision he had ever beheld. You must be Con, she said, offering a hand. Mr. Giblin's nephew. Mr. Ferris has spoken of you often. She stepped back and inspected him carefully. The uniform is quite effective, if I do say so, she laughed, and most becoming. Con blushed heavily, adding in his mind that she was also the most gracious person he had ever encountered. Aren't the cars beautiful? Miss Ferris went on, stepping into number one. So cozy and so immaculate. Why, one could easily keep house here. Uncle Patrick says that all it needs is a cook stove and a dog and a cat to make it a home, Con ventured. And a wife, of course, she left. Haven't you any of those things, Con? No, ma'am, Con admitted, blushing still more deeply. I could start with a cat, though, easy. Our landlady has 18 of them. No, she said, that would never do. The wife first, then the cook stove. The cat and dog will come of their own accord. If she's a good cook, Con said with a grin. Here they are, talking. There's Con in his uniform. Mr. Ferris called them over and handed his wife down the steps to the engine room. He pointed to a few blocks of wood that he had piled on a chair just below the rim of the great wheel. The topmost block was within a half-inch of the curving steel. Just a little test for my own satisfaction, he explained. As you know, many of my fellow engineers have said that we could never build a wheel of this size that would be a perfect circle. It would have bulges, they said. It would sag. It would be lopsided. So, it would never mesh properly with the driving mechanism. It would miss a cog, go out of control, and we would have a frightful catastrophe. Now, let's see. All right, Mr. Barry, you may proceed. Mr. Barry gently moved the throttle, and little Betsy went smoothly into eager action. Silently, the long driving shaft and its sprocket wheels began to turn. The cross links clanked slightly as they meshed accurately with the notches of the rim, so gently that at first the movement was hardly discernible. The great wheel began to move. Mr. Barry opened his throttle wide, and little Betsy willingly responded. Now the spinning crankshaft was a blur. The shining steel balls of the governor became a glimmering halo. The clanking of the chain links stepped up its rhythm. The great wheel was moving at its ordained top speed. The rim flashed past their fascinated gaze evenly. The tiny space between steel rim and wooden blocks never varied in the slightest. The wheel could not have been a more perfect circle. Con drew a great sighing breath of relief as Mr. Barry announced, "Car number 1 just passed. She's made a full turn." "Very good," Mr. Ferris said placidly. "I'm quite satisfied. I just wish some of the prophets of disaster could have been here to see that. Give her another turn for good measure, then we'll have our ride." He escorted Mrs. Ferris up the steps to await the arrival of Con's car. "I'm thinking if anyone told Uncle Patrick that test ought to be made, he'd have knocked his teeth out," Con observed. "I'm sure he would have, bless him," Mrs. Ferris laughed. "His faith in Mr. Ferris's calculations is almost alarming at times, but inspiring too." Mr. Barry brought the wheel to such a smooth, gentle stop that the car scarcely swayed. Con sprang to open the door of number 1, and his passenger stepped aboard. "All right, Con, do your duty and lock us in," Mr. Ferris said. "Tell Barry to give us a full turn and then stop when we're at the top. We'd like to admire the view. I'll switch off the lights so we can see better. When they go on, you can bring us down." Con locked the door and stepped back. Mrs. Ferris smiled and waved. Mr. Barry opened the throttle, and the great Ferris wheel began its first trip carrying passengers. Con was amazed at the soundlessness of it. There was something eerie in the sight of this great mass of steel, more than 2 million pounds of it, rising, turning, and descending steadily, smoothly, all without any sound save for the slight clinking of the roller chains on their sprockets. One would have expected creaks and groans, squeals and scrapings and rattles, but there were none. It was so still that the sudden clang of the boiler door shutting rang with startling loudness. Car 1 passed and rose again. When it reached the summit, Mr. Barry brought the wheel to a gentle stop. He resumed his perusal of Nick Carter, and the fireman again dozed. The bright windows of car number 1 became black. It was late now. All over the fairgrounds, the lights were going out. The sound of the midway faded away. From the lagoons, where thousands of frogs had accepted the new ordering of their world, there was a steady chorus. A midnight mist was rising. A group, Pullman porters, perhaps from the railroad station, or waiters from one of the restaurants, were making their way homeward, out beyond the wheel. They were singing an old spiritual, and there was one tenor voice that rose through the darkness, sweet and soaring as the flight of a gull. There was a full, strong baritone that came and went, now losing itself in the organ like chords of the basses, now rising lone and free, tossing out the words, clear and stirring as a trumpet call. Ezekiel saw the wheel, way up in the middle of the air. Ezekiel saw the wheel, way in the middle of the air. And the little wheel ran by faith, and the big wheel ran by the grace of God. It's a wheel in a wheel, way in the middle of the air. The midway was almost silent now. Somewhere a dog barked, and from the lake came the long hoot of a steamer whistle. The last train pulled out of the railroad station, its bell clanging. Ezekiel saw the wheel, sang the tenor voice, way up in the middle of the air. The mist became thicker, rising halfway up the glowing circle of lighted cars. It blotted out the buildings and the towers so that the great ring seemed to float in the air without earthly ties. Mr. Barry put down his Nick Carter. The singers were drifting into the distance, but the voices, though fainter, still rang hauntingly clear and moving. And the little wheel ran by faith, and the big wheel ran by the grace of God. It's a wheel in a wheel, way in the middle of the air. After a few long moments, the lights flashed on and the car descended. Mrs. Ferris stepped out, her eyes suspiciously moist. "Wasn't it beautiful, Con?" she cried. "The singing. Did you hear it? The little wheel ran by faith, and the big wheel ran by the grace of God." "It's a sign, surely, ma'am," Con said. "It is, I am sure," she agreed, "and we were way up in the middle of the air. The mist hid everything below, but the stars were clear and bright and all around us. I think it has been the most wonderful evening of my life." Mr. Ferris, looking supremely happy, cleared his throat. "Thank you for coming, Con," he said. "It has been a great experience. I hope others find it as thrilling. It was fun having our wheel all to ourselves, but what was it Lewis the something said? After me, the deluge. After us, the multitude of cash customers, we hope. Better get a good sleep. Tomorrow you'll have a busy day." As Con walked home through the misty darkness, the haunting spiritual still ran through his head. The little wheel ran by faith. It seemed to give him a word and a meaning that had been eluding him. What was it that had rung so unquestioningly in Uncle Patrick's simple answer this afternoon when he declared Mr. Ferris said it would? What had suddenly moved Martin Brennan and Scrimer to nonchalantly ride the great shaft, rising it on its untried tackle? Why did Stonewall Jackson's men daily risk their lives at the mere wave of his walking stick? No one had ever ridden the great wheel before, but Mrs. Ferris's only thought had been for the beauty of it all. What was it that had shone so steadily in Trudy's eyes that last evening on the ship as she said, with such serene certainty, "I will wait, and you will come. It is your fortune." He had been unable to put a name to it, but now he knew. Softly he hummed the song that he would never forget. And the little wheel ran by faith, and the big wheel ran by the grace of God. It's a wheel in a wheel, way in the middle of the air.